So first of all, I should tell you a little bit about this talk. So this is the first time I'll be giving a talk that will likely happen at Agile 2015 in August as well. So the talk at Agile 2015 will include Jeff Sutherland as a co-presenter and incorporate some of his work as well. Jeff is the guy who invented Scrum. You don't know that. He and I worked together on, we kind of live in this weird academic plus practical world. So we host a track at a system science conference in Hawaii every year. And that has a lot of academics in it, and they spend a lot of time trying to prove things that don't have much value to actual industrialists like us. So Jeff and I like to hang out with those guys to help them kind of direct their energy at stuff that will help us. Okay, so today we're going to talk about Agile leadership patterns, but they're really Agile patterns. And how this came about was that Jeff told me that I was dumb for continuing to spend time worrying about Agile because it wasn't very well defined. He said, hey, have you seen the Agile Manifesto? It's pretty vague. Plus, it's all about software. And so if you're doing Agile, I guess you have to do software. You should do Scrum because Scrum doesn't say anything about software particularly. And I said, first of all, I went, that's kind of, is that really true? And then the second thing I said was, hey, a challenge, that's kind of interesting, right? So I started investigating agility as a defined science, and there wasn't much. So that gave me an opportunity to try to hit my clicker and advance the slide.
Try again.
Okay, good. So I said, well, if I were defining Agile, how would I do it? And the thing that I decided that I wanted to do was create a pattern language. So how many of you have ever seen Christopher Alexander's book, A Pattern Language? Have you ever seen that? So we've got like 2 people. So this book was kind of a revolution in the architecture field. And by that I mean the residential and building type of architecture field, where it defined healthy communities. So these were ecosystems of related concepts about buildings and mortuaries and rivers and walks and all sorts of other stuff, and how they all fit together. And when you read it, it's really a beautiful book. I recommend that you check it out. It was written in 1977 or so. So pattern languages, as defined by Alexander, then made it into something called the Gang of Four book, which you might have heard of. The Gamma book, has anyone ever read that book? So we have a few more of those people, and those guys were influenced by Alexander to create these pattern languages that you could use to design software. So I thought that was really interesting starting point. The other starting point is chaos theory, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll go into these base patterns. There are 5. So if you have 5 patterns at your fingertips, my assertion, and you should try to prove me wrong during this discussion, think about these patterns and see if you can figure out how they don't work, because that's really helpful to me, these 5 patterns can tell us, is your team, is your company, are you as a person Agile or not? Okay? You only need 3 of these patterns to tell you that. And then the other patterns give you a greater resiliency and strength, and we'll see what happens with those. So, you got the introduction, that's cool. I used to hang out at IBM Research, being a nerd, and then I was a startup guy for a while, and so that was useful. So, how many people have been doing Agile for less than 2 years? Could you please raise your hand? Okay. How many people have been doing it for more than 5 years? All right. How many people have inbox 0? Know what that is? Hey, congratulations. I get to raise my hand because I've been at Inbox Zero for 3 days. Thanks. How many people are using Lean Startup? Oh, very good. Okay, cool. So I think all of these things are Agile practices. I put them all in a big bucket. So XP, getting things done, Inbox Zero, Lean Startup, all these things have a similar flavor. And oftentimes the people that are doing one of these things are trying to do the other ones, or at least are very intrigued by them. I thought that was really interesting. That was sort of connective tissue between what I think lean things are. And I said, so maybe we could, maybe they all have some common elements, and those common elements tell us something about agility the way we perceive it. And then maybe we can make some deductions about the different methodologies and things that they might need to help them out. And we'll see if you agree with me that there's opportunity there. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is chaos. So how many people know what chaos theory is? Okay, so you're about to find out. So chaos theory says this. If we happen to know the position of everybody in this room exactly, and let's ignore quantum physics for the time being, but if we knew where all our atoms were exactly, then we could put it in some massive computer and we could simulate it over time, and it would tell us exactly what we would be doing 20 years from now, okay? But in actuality, that doesn't happen, and chaos theory tells us this, that because we only know approximately where each of our atoms are, or where we're looking at the time, or in bigger pictures, how many people are actually living in Santa Barbara, we know this approximately, and over time, our forecasts and predictions diverge from what really is happening, and it's all because of these little errors at the beginning that grow exponentially over time to the point that we can't predict the future, right? It's the idea that a butterfly, waving its wings could cause a hurricane somewhere in the Caribbean. The idea is that these little things cause big effects. And chaos theory says this, here's something that we do know about chaotic systems. If we know the approximate position of things currently, we can kind of predict where they're going to be in a short period of time. But the farther we go, the more difficult it is to predict where these things are going. So chaos theory is related to economics. So we all operate in these economic systems with markets and that sort of thing. And we can predict where the market will be for a note-taking system that Citrix might be developing, we hope, right? Because we've gone to survey users and all that other stuff. And for the beginning of the introduction of this product, we might get results that resonate a little with our predictions. But over time, things will diverge rapidly. And it will be caused by things like competitors. It could be caused by new technology introductions. It could be caused by, well, all sorts of things. User behavior, that sort of thing. So chaos, I think, is where it's at, because chaos is a really good model for economics. And that brings us to Agile a little bit. So agility, the way I define agility, is this, that an Agile organization or an Agile person can sense, adapt, and change rapidly enough to keep up with the chaos in their economy. So you and I operate in an economy. We all go to work. If we're programmers, our economy is based on how rapidly we produce code, how well we work with our teammates, the things that we produce. And then the company, from the product management's point of view, their economy is based on markets. So how does the market respond to our new introduction of beta? If we sense how the market is responding fast enough, if we adapt rapidly enough to what we're seeing in that market, and we create something new that better fits the market's needs, then we are beating the chaos in the actual economy. And that win is something that will help us win and become more successful. So with chaos in mind, I constructed a set of 5 patterns, and you don't have to memorize these because we're going to go through each of them in detail. So I think these patterns help us define agility. So these 3 first patterns, I think if you do them, you might be agile. Not sure. I'll let you decide. You're going to help me figure it out. So the first one is, the way patterns work is this. You articulate a problem facing the world or you or your organization, and you talk a little bit about the forces that might constrain a solution to this problem. So the problem we have is that plans are not guaranteeing our success, right? We've seen this too many times, that we make these great, grandiose plans, like the waterfall plan, for example, where you have a 300-page PRD, product requirements document, and then we slap it on the table of someone, and someone says, wow, that's a great 300-page PRD, I guess I won't read that. And then we all go off and do what we need to do. I mean, like, I don't know how many people have actually, I think I read a PRD once, but I've had probably 5 sitting on my desk at different times. So the forces that we face with these plans is that there's a bunch of things that we know about economics and the people's behavior. So one of them is that different economies have different rules. So a production economy is one in which we're trying to save money, we're trying to produce more things for less money. So that's what Scrum does. So if you think about Scrum, you're always thinking about velocity, you're always thinking about teamwork, you're always trying to produce something, and you're trying to keep the quality high. The reason you keep the quality high is you just don't want someone to send it back and have to do rework all the time to get it better and better, right? So that has a cost-based economy is the way I would describe it. And then Lean Startup, on the other side, is all about creating something that you think the market will like, and then finding out that it doesn't, or it likes something slightly different. And then you keep testing that. Well, that's a different type of economy. That is a value side economy. And it turns out having Lean Startup and Scrum together is really awesome because you're starting to control costs through Scrum, you're starting to control value through Lean Startup, and the two together really make a great combo. So that's interesting. There's one more kind of phenomenon that's a little bit interesting, and that is if bosses do not set a mission, vision, and goals for you, or they don't try to work with you to align your personal mission with the mission of the company, then each employee starts making their own personal rules about how to live their life. And that, I think that there's a dialogue that should happen between the executives and the people on the ground, so the people on the ground are getting some of their values satisfied, while the people and the bosses are also getting their values satisfied, and that alignment creates a lot of strength. The other thing, another force that's important is success metrics lag the work. So the best success metrics are things like stock price, profitability, other stuff like that. But those happen so late in the game that you can't really tell whether the work that you're currently doing or you just released is really valuable to you. So you have to figure out how to measure things that are closer to the time that you deliver something. Thanks. And that is, so success metrics lag, and that's a problem. Oftentimes other things are missing, like risk. So measuring risk, it turns out to be really hard. There's perversity. Perversity is a technical term, actually, that relates to metric perversity. So you can have perverse metrics, and what they are is metrics that you think are really important, like revenue. Sounds like a really good thing to have. But if your company is based solely on revenue, what will happen is that your marketing department will go into overdrive and advertise the crap out of your thing, and it'll start getting a lot more revenue, and your company will go bankrupt. That's a perverse metric, right? Finally, there's cognitive bias, which means that, well, there's a bunch of biases, and we can talk forever about that, but they're generally things that people generally have. And we'll talk about one cognitive bias soon. So finally, one thing that's really important to me is that we all recognize something, that creativity generates variation. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of people from the Six Sigma crowd who are really into, you guys estimated a certain amount of story points, and at the end, you were way off. And then they say, we got to fix that. Okay? Well, no, you don't, right? You have to fix some of it. Like if you were off, if you weren't doing anything really innovative, and you're really off, maybe you should have a conversation about that. But if you're doing creative work, if you're generating something substantially new, you're going to get variation for sure. And those people who try to tamp that down generally cause their company to stop innovating. So that's kind of sad. And then we have other things. If you've never, how many people have seen Dan Pink talk on YouTube about mastery, autonomy, and purpose? That is a great YouTube video. If you've not seen it, it turns out that rewarding people with money for doing creative work is not correlated with success. It actually kind of destroys creativity. So that's challenging, right? Because if we're really creative and really smart, we think we ought to get a bigger salary. And I agree, right? Because we're providing a lot of benefit to the company. But somehow, the things that really reward creative people is this notion that they're gaining mastery over a field. They're gaining autonomy within the company, making decisions for themselves, and that they have a higher purpose that they're trying to deliver, like we're trying to help people communicate better. So that would be a Citrix goal. So those are interesting forces. And then, so then I talked about this problem and I kind of constrained some solutions. So now in a pattern, we said, well, what could we do that would kind of satisfy most of those patterns? Well, what we need to do is we need to measure our progress. We can't measure our total success. So we have to come up with leading indicators that help us determine whether we've made it close to our goal. And so desired outcomes. We have more functionality coming out of our team. In other words, our velocity might go up, right? That's an outcome, and then the metric can be velocity. We have a forecasting discipline, because if we have a forecasting discipline, we're now validating whether the metrics that we have really relate to the success outcome. So some of the times I talk about Agile, you know, and there's a bunch of spiritualist Agilists, I guess, and I'm kind of a math Agilist, I guess. So I start talking about this stuff about metrics and forecasting and stuff like that, and some of them lose their minds. Oh well. But I actually think these Agile techniques are super important for helping us measure how we're doing and getting better at what we're doing. And so objectivity becomes super important as well. We have to get away from these biases that we often have, and we have to embrace this idea that people talk the truth all the time. And so when you talk to Agilists, they're always, some of them are a little bit brash and blunt, which I sometimes am, and then we have to figure out how to incorporate that brash bluntness into our system in order to accommodate objectivity. So the metrics will evolve over time. So when you start a startup, for example, the startup will probably want to show market traction first, and in order to get venture capital funding. They don't necessarily have to show profitability. So the first metrics that you might use are important for the startup, but will evolve over time. So we just have to recognize that because they're leading indicators, they're not perfect, and their particular form will evolve. So, so the way this pattern came about was, all these patterns came about. I basically took every methodology in Agile practice, all the ones that I talked about and a few others. I took all of the things they did, sprints, Scrum Master, retrospectives, work in progress limits and Kanban, swim lanes, all that stuff, and I stuck them in this big mess, right? I just put a big pile of all the things there, and then I said, I want to group the things that have a lot of common elements. Okay? So it turns out there's a lot of stuff in measuring economic progress that is in lots of things, like velocity in Scrum, for example. Or build, measure, learn, there's a measure in there for lean startup. So, so that's interesting. And that KPIs, key performance indicators, that's where those live. So these type of KPIs are ones that help us sense rapidly and give us guidance about how to adapt and what to create next. Does it make sense? Am I confused, everyone? Okay, good. All right, another thing that is true is that goal flow, strategy, tactics, and operations, they're going from big picture ideas, strategy, tactics, which is what we do as a manager, I guess, from day to day, and operations, what as individual contributors we do from day to day. It turns out that if the goal flows the other direction, if we go from operations or individual contributors and we flow back up into the organization, we get this big confused thing up at the top. What has to happen is that the organization as a whole has to set the direction, or we start not performing in consort. And this is the purpose of executives. So at a minimum, they need to be incorporating the interests and needs of the people in the organization, as well as what everyone perceives market realities to be. If they aren't doing that, if they're letting the organization just go wherever it's going to go, it's not likely that this organization will last very long. And so, in my field, in our field of agility, we do have people that just would like to, fire all the managers. But they have an important purpose, and they have the same sort of purpose you can think of with a conductor of an orchestra. So if that person is not there, all those great performers as individuals will not perform in consort. And so that's what we look for in these leaders to help us unify our attempts to succeed. All right, so the result of this, coherent mission, vision, and goals throughout the organization, a handful of evolving metrics. If we have too many metrics, they get really confusing. And we learn from failure and success because we're always measuring. We're always trying to find out whether we're doing better. And then we forecast. But are we agile? So this is a question for you. Are we agile? And if not, why not? Any thoughts?
You said there was 3 components we have to be agile, so this is only one.
Yeah, I know. I kind of screwed that up. Why isn't this enough? Why couldn't we do? Remember what I said agility was. We can sense, adapt, and create fast enough to actually beat the chaos in the marketplace.
This is all just sensing.
This is all just sensing. That's right. That's right. We're not doing anything necessarily. The other thing that might happen is, well, I guess you're leading in, which is great. Reacting is not enough to succeed. So if we're monitoring stuff, we can actually tell that stuff is happening in the marketplace that's kind of messing us up, right? We can tell that some competitor emerges in the note-taking space that is worrying us. But if we aren't experimenting, if we're not testing things ourselves, we can get blindsided by someone that just comes up with this enormously different thing. And so these are the forces that affect us. The complacency lulls us, especially when we have a strong brand. So this should always be a worry for Citrix. Citrix has a strong brand. It's easy to displace it through some really interesting, disruptive innovation. And it will be displaced unless we ourselves think about little disruptions that we can cause to ourselves in order to become better. So loss of control, though, scares us. So if we're actually going to challenge ourselves, that's a little bit scary because something bad could happen. And we've all seen huge failures, which are really miserable, right? And things go bankrupt and that sort of thing when people over-disrupt themselves. It's really easy to measure operational work. So it's really easy to go in and say, hey, you know, here's what the throughput was for the customer service department in answering calls. That is an operational thing, and not to, I just think that there's more creativity in other parts of the business than that part. And so you see this operational thing, this semi-non-creative activity. There's creativity in customer service for sure, but it's just happening on a regular basis and it's kind of well known what to do. It's not so well known what to do when we're talking about product management or when we're talking about development. So we tend to do this. When someone says we have to measure our progress, the first thing we think about is what is easy to measure. Well, the easy thing to measure is operations. And so uncertainty just confuses us, and that's kind of miserable, but that's where the gold lives. So when we're in this uncertain situation, creativity will get us out of that, and it might not have gotten a competitor out of that, and we can win. So that's a pretty interesting thing. So in order to deal with this situation where reaction is not fast enough, we should adaptively experiment. In other words, we should try things, new things that might not work. And so that's what the purpose of a retrospective is, actually. So does everybody know what a retrospective is? Does everybody have a retrospective? Who has a retrospective? So most of us do. So a retrospective, let me ask a different question. How many people had a retrospective that lasted at least an hour in the last month? One meeting that lasted at least an hour. Okay, good. So what that tells me is you're actually giving enough time in your retrospective to think through a production experiment that you might run next time. How are we going to change what we're doing next time to see if we can amp up the velocity or decrease the quality, or decrease the number of bugs. Right. So that's cool. Improvement experiments are something that will help us. Another thing that's important to remember is that some improvements are evolutionary and some are revolutionary. And we can't forget to do revolutionary ones. The evolutionary ones are what Kaizen suggests. So this is this incremental testing and improvement on small little things that you're doing in your process. The problem with those things is you sometimes end up doing what's called the greedy algorithm. We just try to get a little bit better every time, and then we end up in this kind of mediocre place because we're not willing to take any challenging changes. And so this revolutionary idea is also important. So your team should kind of shuttle between evolution and revolution in order to get a great outcome. We always have a brainstorming session in a retrospective where we consider what are different options for us to do. And then here's something that most retrospectives do not do. They do not construct a hypothesis. And I think that's a shame. So I think if you decide that we're going to give, we're going to improve our ready criteria, for example, in order so that when we start something, we don't have all these dependencies that have to be satisfied and therefore slow the team down. I think someone should say, hey, you know, we're beefing up our ready criteria. That means our velocity should go up by at least 20%. And then we should go prove it. Because it makes us honest. You know, we're really running an experiment. We're going to really try. In order to control an experiment like that, you have to have a strong Scrum Master. So in other words, if you have a ready criteria and your team doesn't actually, you know, adhere to the ready criteria that you said you were going to do, your retrospective is not going to come up with a conclusion that's really helpful to you. Does that make sense what I just said? So, okay. And then, of course, beware of those people who tell us that we should control variability, because you don't necessarily want to do that. Okay, so then I just constructed the Scrum retrospective for you, but in a different way, right? I said we look at the economic progress historically. We validate the hypothesis of the last experiment, so that these metrics look like what we expected them to look like. Are they higher, lower? What happened? We might discover that these dependencies that we had in our ready criteria, that this prohibition on dependencies like accelerated us far more than 20%. It might, you know, I've seen it happen when people have said this, that their velocity went up by 50% or more than that from that one little change. And it's nice to know that, because then you can use that historical evidence to put pressure on your product manager to do a better job of controlling dependencies. So we just, then we brainstorm, identify changes, hypothesize, and commit. And so that commit, in my mind, is going to a Scrum Master, or if you don't have one, going to the whole team, and all agreeing that you'll adhere to these rules. So I guess I've given you the answer, which is a danger when you give a talk. What does the Scrum Master do in Scrum? You can even answer the obvious answer, if you haven't.
Controls the experiment.
Controls the experiment. When do they control the experiment?
While the work is happening,
Okay, between when and when?
between retrospectives.
Sure, like at the end of the retrospective, they start controlling the experiment, and when do they stop?
To be right before the next one,
Right.
before measurement.
Sounds good. So, like after the sprint review, or sprint demo. So what do they do what do they do otherwise? What's their role otherwise?
They're a developer.
That is a different role.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. I mean, it is true that some Scrum Masters also serve as developers, but that's a different role for them. So when they're acting like a Scrum Master, we talked about the period from basically sprint planning through the beginning of sprint planning to the end of sprint review. Okay, they are controlling the experiment. But there's another part of Scrum, another meeting in Scrum, where it's not between those two. What is it?
Facilitate retrospective.
Retrospective. So what's the Scrum Master's role in that retrospective?
Help the team analyze,
Yeah,
hypothesize.
yeah, all that stuff. They're sort of the facilitator.
Yeah.
And this is why being a Scrum Master is such a pain in the butt, right? It's because you have to switch gears. Like while you're in the retrospective, you want to be very facilitative. You want to kind of stand away and let people brainstorm and think about great stuff and whatever. But once they conclude what to do and what the rules are, you have to become a police officer. And how many of us know really facilitative police officers? They're not very common, right? So, and the ones that are, they're awesome. Right? Like if you meet a facilitative police officer, you just want to give them, you want to double their pay. Because it's very hard to do those two things. And so that's one of the reasons why being a Scrum Master is a really challenging position, because you have to be a facilitator and then you have to be an enforcer. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Anyway, so adaptively experiment for improvement. So now I've sort of told you that I think I didn't quite come out and say it, but I'm saying it now. I think the retrospective is the very first meeting of Scrum. Why do I say that?
Because you're forming hypotheses.
Yes. You did. Okay, hi. Yes, you're forming a hypothesis, right? You're a scientist. You're creating the condition. You're deciding what the experiment will be. You could even in your retrospective, you could say, we're not going to do Scrum for the next 2 weeks. We're going to try waterfall. You could, right? You could say, and then you would go like, well, how are we going to measure our progress? Well, we're not going to ship at the end of the sprint or anything like that, and we have to figure out some way to measure our progress, and you might come up with some kind of cockamamie idea. How about thousands of lines of code, or something like that? You'll come up with some metric. But if you have a retrospective at the beginning of every time period, you'll think about metrics and you'll impose those metrics, and at the end you'll measure those metrics. And I make an assertion here. I say, if you run retrospectives, good retrospectives, I don't care what meetings you have inside your sprint. I think eventually, if you need all those other meetings from Scrum, you will figure it out. Because you'll be running these experiments every time, and you'll be thinking consciously about what we're delivering and whether it satisfies the need. So I think the retrospective is the first meeting. And I think the very first meeting of a Scrum team is, let's talk about history. What worked for us before? What do we think our velocity used to be, or what we could call our velocity? And how many people have gone to a CSM training? Anybody? Certified Scrum Master training. So you go to these meetings and they tell you how to estimate what your velocity should be if you've never run Scrum before. And you use that data to run your experiment, first one. Okay. Anyway, that's the second pattern. So the results of doing that, it turns out you can go hyper-productive. So this is a great paper. This is Jacobson. Karsten Jacobson wrote a paper from a company in Systematic Corporation based in the Netherlands. Their company was what's called CMMI-5. This is a highly controlled company that produces software. And they compared Scrum versus Waterfall. And they discovered that quality improved 40% in Scrum. The number of bugs that were produced in Scrum was 40% less, and the productivity of the Scrum team in terms of satisfying customer needs was twice. So in other words, the quality went up, and the speed also went up, double. So that's a really interesting thing, and it's largely due to this experimentation strategy. So this also applies to a bigger scale. It applies to a company. So you see what's happening here. There's no software in here. These principles are not software principles. They're principles of agility in chaos. And so I argue that the best organizations disrupt themselves. So they look to see what likely might improve, and they try experiments and go. So are we agile now? And if we're not agile, why not? Why not?
We've sensed and we've adapted.
We've sensed, we've adapted, we can create. We've got an experiment. Creation is part of the experiment. So remember I said you sense, adapt, and create rapidly enough to beat the chaotic economy you live in. So, have we done that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes? What if this sprint was 8 months long?
Maybe.
Maybe. That's a good answer. Maybe. Right? The problem is we might not be fast enough. And there's nothing in this system that really pushes us in this direction. But I think you're right in a way. like one of the things that happened as I was doing these patterns is I wanted to make sure the first patterns were super general. And if you just kind of did the first pattern and you consistently did it, then maybe you would stumble upon this idea that you need to experiment. And now that you're experimenting, maybe you would stumble on this idea that you need to do some other things. And so this is called a generative pattern structure. So the first pattern is enough as long as you keep doing it. But we want to make you go, we want to get you there faster, so we're going to give you some hints. So this is a hint. You should adaptively experiment. And the next one is this issue. So we oftentimes try to plan our experiments too much. So a waterfall project is kind of an experiment. We've got a plan and we've got PMO people tracking our progress against the plan, and if they were really honest, they would go back to the very original plan and say, gosh, it said 18 months, but we haven't really shipped, and it's 24 months into the project. But still, that is an experiment. It's just a long experiment, right? So there's a bunch of issues here, and that is that plans are something called a non-fungible asset. You can't sell them. But you put a lot of work into them. So you just keep working and working and trying to make the plans better because the boss is saying, if you just plan more, we would be more successful. So now what's weird is you get into a kind of, this is called a bias, a cognitive bias, and it's called the sunk cost fallacy. So this idea is that when you have spent a lot of money or a lot of time on something, you don't want to give up.
Right.
Even if it's a disaster. Even if everything tells you it's stupid. Okay? I had a startup company. I discovered that there was no market for, location-based advertising networks. This was back in 2005. There is one now. And I said, there's no market in here. And then I go like, but I got to keep working. That was really stupid, right? Like I probably spent an extra couple $100,000 in that startup than I should have. But that's a sunk cost fallacy at work. We all suffer from it. And so the issue is to try to avoid that. But the plans are a form of sunk cost. We have spent a lot of time on this 300-page PRD. And we're just going to stick to this plan regardless. So that's influencing us. Congestion and cognition are on different slides, so I thought I would talk about them. So one of the things that we often do is we say, oh, am I running out of time?
My hand waving at 7:20.
All right, good. Well, congestion is an issue. So I'm going to go a little faster. So one of the things that we should know is that it's hard to think about a bunch of concepts at once. And this is related to the problem. So if we're thinking about too many things at once, we're going to bog down, we're going to slow down substantially. And there's a lot of things that affect cognition. So the answer to these problems is to limit work in process. And the way you do that is you run a sprint. Okay? And the way you keep your work in process low is what do you do at the end of the sprint? What do you do at the end of the sprint? To keep what? You can demo it.
Release.
That's a good thing. What did you say?
Release.
Release. That's even better, right? Like you demo it and you still got work in process because it hasn't quite made it out to the customer. You release and now it's in the customer's hands. And you know what? We could all quit and it would still be okay because the work is out there. There's no work in process anymore. So that's what, there's a bunch of patterns that relate to that. So now the question is, so this is limit work in process, and there's a bunch of things like, the sprint size. Do you have a product owner that's telling you what the most important things are to do? Illegitimus non interruptus means the Scrum team is not allowed to be interrupted in the middle of its work, and the reason you do that is because when you interrupt a team, you create more work in process. So this kind of helps. So We can rapidly deliver small increments of value. We have the possibility of rapid feedback. We can discover that stuff and feed it into our experiment. We can cancel the work because the sunk cost is low. We don't feel an obligation to continue. And we learn faster, ideally, than the chaotic economy emerges. So those three patterns tell us we're agile. So the interesting thing is when someone says, are we agile? You can bring these patterns up. You can say, well, are we measuring our progress? If we're not measuring our progress, let's say we're one of those no estimates teams that says, you know, we don't need any story points. We don't even need to count the number of stories we complete in a sprint. We just know that developers are good and developers should just keep being good and just leave us alone, you managers and stuff. So that is not a measured thing. They're not measuring their progress. And so there's no way to know whether a new process is helping them speed up except through some kind of emotional feeling about it. So I would argue that we have to measure something. We have to measure either the number of things we finish or the bigness of them. Then the second thing I said was adaptively experiment to improve. And I argue that a retrospective is that thing. So if you have a lame retrospective, which many teams do, you're probably not agile. You're not improving fast enough to really match the economy that you're facing from competitors. And then the last thing is limiting work in process, meaning having a short sprint time. The problem is if you make the sprint too short, you sacrifice the other things. So, for example, if you make your sprint too short and you can't actually produce a shippable product, you have lost a very good metric, which is how many usable things can we produce in a time period. And so I've often went to teams that had 2-week sprints, but they couldn't ship at the end of 2 weeks. And I've said, hey, please just increase your sprint length, because you can't do the testing you need to do to actually deliver this. So I'm not going to talk about the details of these slides, but I'm going to go through them. You know what? I'm not even going to talk about them because I'm going to go all the way to this last little bit. And first of all, I'm going to show you how I think of Scrum. So we measure economic progress as I suggested. So we have like a spreadsheet, or you write it on a board or something like that. And then we adaptively experiment. So we decide on an experiment that we're going to produce. And this experiment, it turns out, has sprint planning, a daily Scrum, and then sprint review, and we ship. So that's a classic Scrum process. So we will do Scrum. That's one of the process rules for this experiment. But you can put Kanban down here, right? You can put Kanban, you can put waterfall, you can put anything in there. And I now say, sure, you want to do Kanban. That's cool. Measure. I want you to tell me that you're improving, and I want it to be on a regular basis. I don't want it to be whenever you think it's a good idea. So I think Scrum is agile because it adheres to these patterns. These three first patterns are what I call fragile agile. It really is agile, but it might not last. And the reason is it's missing something. So there are lots of things that can destroy agility. So one thing that can happen is your department can silo. So that would be saying, and I've seen this before, saying, we've got a big engineering team, but what we're going to do is we're going to allocate this set of engineering with this budget to these people. We're going to allocate this set of engineering with this budget to those people, and so forth, and have that be kind of a permanent, once-a-year allocation. What happens is the organization itself loses the ability to shift people from one product to another when we've discovered that a product is super profitable. We should be able to do that because then the organization is adapting to its economy. But when we silo like that, it stops us. So then there's a bunch of other things that we have to worry about. So we know that Agile is fragile because we know some companies where they've hired coaches for, like $3 million worth of coaches. For Walmart did this 5 times. I kid you not. Okay, Walmart Labs up in the Bay Area, they hired a bunch of coaches, they converted all the teams, and it turns out the executives were not operating in an agile way themselves, and they got embarrassed because of some of the things that were emerging from the Scrum teams, reporting things and trying to remove impediments. And then they said, hey coaches, you gotta go. The coaches left, they lost it. And they hired a bunch more. Because at first I think Rally even was one of the first ones, and they said, hey, you Rally coaches, you suck, right? We're gonna get coaches that will work, right? And then they hired some other group, and then they got mad at them, and then they got mad at the other ones. And then you go like, what's constant here, right? Anyway, Yahoo did the same thing. It's now on its 3rd or 4th run, and I know the people doing it, and they seem pretty reasonable. One of the issues is that this is bottom-up agility. This is where we say agility is something for the teams, something for engineering. It's not for us, the people in the executive suite. We don't have to experiment. We don't have to limit our working process. We don't have to measure our success. So that's a problem. So we want to talk about that. Top-down Agile is something I advocate. I wrote a big blog post on it. So here's why it's valuable. We get faster, more profitable strategic decisions. That's on the executive side as well as down in the ground. And we get faster, more profitable delivery, better solutions, more organizational focus. How much is that worth? Right? It's worth millions and millions because you can create an organization that is going to beat the crap out of any competitor. And we see some of those in the market today, and they are fearsome, right? They are scary. And that is what we should be. We should be scared in the market. But the only way to do that is to adopt some of these practices. So, let's see. That could be it. I'm just going to bring it back to this graphic at the very beginning, which is too long. There we go. So I think these patterns are where it's at. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this one and this one. So collective responsibility is the idea that when I join a team, I am signing a contract, and here is the contract. I agree, by joining this team, that I will be personally responsible for the collective output of this team. Okay? That means if this team produced something that is poorly tested and has lots of bugs, whose fault is that? Whose fault is that? It's the team's. It's someone else's fault as well. Whose? Mine. Right? That's the contract. That's a pretty strong statement, right? Like many of us are kind of queasy about that given the people that we happen to hang out with at the time. Maybe you could stop smoking pot in the morning, Joe, you know? Right? So that collective responsibility creates things that we know of in Agile. So one of them is collective code ownership from XP. So this idea that no one owns a piece of code. But the other things that it does is it encourages us not to be developers only. So when we have testing responsibilities that exceed the current capabilities of QA people, if we have those people on our team, we will pitch in because we have signed that contract, at least in our heads. So collective responsibility turns out to create all sorts of successes. And so there's a lot of, one of the things in doing this research that I've been doing is I'm discovering that these things affect education. So one of the things that a school system discovered is when everyone, when they were dealing with at-risk kids in high schools, and they said, we're going to get the teachers to feel personally responsible for the success of the student. The student should feel personally responsible for the success of the student, and the parents need to be too, and the administrators. When they started having these conversations and making sure that everyone felt this way, the students did something huge, like 40% better. It was huge, right? And you can see that, right? Like if we really embrace this idea, it's going to make a big difference. And the fifth thing so here's what happens when you get the fourth thing. You get what I call resilient agility. So your team will continue to be agile even though it's buffeted about by weird things like executives coming in and stealing your database stuff. Okay, some executive comes in, steals your database guy, and you go like, I signed that stupid contract, like what am I going to do now? So the choices are you could hire a database guy or you could try to figure it out. Right? But you're going to do it because you signed the contract. And then the fifth thing is solve systemic problems. And this is kind of an expansive agility. So now you're a team, you depend on other teams perhaps. And those dependencies mess up your agility. You're not able to ship because someone sends you buggy stuff. So there's a whole bunch of things that we do in Agile that we don't actually put in a methodology per se. So Marcia and I and Rahul have done root cause analysis with these 5 whys structures around it. And what that does is that helps tell us where we have serious problems that might or might not be in our team. And then when we see that something is happening outside our team, we try to figure out how to solve that problem. So we had that problem in the user experience department at Citrix when the marketing department would come in and raid the UX department for its very creative visual graphics people. And say, our hair's on fire and we have this deadline that we promised someone that we would do yesterday and it's not done, can you help us? And we went in, I think it was Nick Kim and I went in and taught the marketing department how to do Scrum, right? Because we're going, what is your problem? Like, you should have known this a month ago that you needed this help, and can't you hire some people that would do that for you? And anyway, it was really obvious that they weren't controlling anything there. And then they did. They started using Scrum. They used Scrum for their graphics team, and then they also expanded that to use it for their executives, their directors and the VP all use Scrum. So that helped a lot. Like the UX people kind of were relieved, I think. I don't know who was there when that was happening. Thank you. Thank you for confirming that. Okay, so these 5 things, this is Agile. So if you're doing these 5 things, you are Agile, and this is helping you expand your agility outside your boundaries. So an example of this, see how much over I am. So an example of this, I'm going to take 2 more minutes. Example of this is Toyota, which is a famous Agile company. Most of us think of it as a lean manufacturing company, but it's the source of a lot of this stuff. So they started doing just-in-time manufacturing back in, I want to say, the 40s or something. And they didn't build the tires themselves. They bought those tires from manufacturers. And then someone would order a car, and they would start assembling it, and they would say, oh, gosh, we need tires. And then they would go to the tire manufacturer, and the tire manufacturer would say, well, you should have ordered that like 6 months ago because we pre-order all this stuff, and you need to stick it in your warehouse. And Toyota said, well, that kind of sucks because then what happens if the market demand changes? We want to be agile. And so what they did was they had to teach all of their suppliers how to do just-in-time manufacturing, lean manufacturing. And they did. So that's one of the reasons why Japan was a fearsome manufacturer of automobiles, not just in Toyota. it was in Honda and all these other things because the supplier started doing it and then Honda started doing it and blah, blah, blah. And then that extended to GM. So Toyota taught GM back in the 80s, I think, how to do just-in-time, high-quality car manufacturing in Fremont, California. And when they did that, they did it. It was a trade. Like Toyota wanted to go into the US and it needed to employ US workers and it didn't know how to do that. And then GM was kind of going like, hey, you know, you're taking our market away and we have to give rebates on these cars and you don't have to. And you know, like they were getting worried. And it was weird, like, what would you do? You're GM and Toyota walks in the door and says, hey, you know what? We want to do a joint manufacturing facility in the US. Would you do it with us and we'll give you a trade. We'll teach you how to do just-in-time manufacturing. We're going to run this, factory with just-in-time. And GM said, really? And said, okay. So then GM did it, and then they agreed, and then that factory started producing the best quality cars that GM had in the entire fleet, and they had like 25 factories throughout the US. So you would think, that's really cool, GM should have gotten a clue in 1985. But they did not, right? They didn't. And it's because this is really hard. And that flies in the face of executive, you know, how did executives rise up in the ladder in GM? They didn't raise up in the ladder by running experiments and failing half the time. You know, there's a lot of issues here. And so Toyota was able to preserve its lead, and it was fine while GM went bankrupt back in 2007, something like that. Anyway, so anyway, these things are very hard, even if someone hands them to you on a silver platter. That is the summary of these patterns. And so, questions? Yeah.
Embrace collective responsibility.
Yeah.
What's some of the best practices in implementing that in your team?
There's a bunch, and are these slides available to people? Okay, so I'll show you a few. Okay. So first of all, information radiators are a great way to improve collective responsibility. If everybody is seeing the current condition of the task burn down and you know what tasks are in progress and so forth, you can pretty much see quickly, are people spreading themselves out over different tasks, in which case you're increasing your work in process and you're probably not going to make your sprint. And so those are really useful things for helping people get that. There's a process called the responsibility process, which is probably too complicated to describe right now, but it helps people understand why we do these non-responsible things. Like, we blame other people for a failure. That's a very common thing in most companies, especially in giant companies where you know, there's someone like a million desks away that you can blame for this and never receive any personal ramifications for that. So when you have the responsibility process, basically you understand that there are these dysfunctional things you can do and that everybody does them. Like whenever there's a failure, we all do the same stupid things. We blame someone else, we blame the company, we blame ourselves by feeling guilty, and then of course we don't do anything when we feel guilty, we just mope, right? Doesn't solve a problem. So the end result that you want to get to is this responsibility state where you say, yes, you know, I was partly responsible for this problem because I forgot to do this, or I didn't realize I should have done this. I'll do this next time, or I'll change something next time. And when everybody understands that on your team, they can help each other move in that direction. And then you get a kind of nice thing, you know, like everybody starts doing that, and then you just fix stuff all the time, and people don't really feel guilty or blame other people. This collaborative root cause mapping strategy that Marcia and Rahul and Nick and other people have done is really useful. There's a description on the Cenex Rex website of this, and that's probably the best thing to do, but it's a social way of doing root cause analysis, and that socialness helps people figure out that, well, there's like 5 different things we could have done that would have prevented this problem, and there's like 4 different people that could have done them, and so how do we say so-and-so is to blame? That's interesting. So those are some hints. Yes. Yes.
So it's hard enough to give your team the space to just work on the sprint and not fight fires all the time, right? But if you're also making experiments that might fail half the time, then that means that half the time you're going to be doing a bunch of stuff that doesn't appear to be aligned with your executives' desires, right? So, you know, my team is focused on producing software.
Yeah.
If I show up in the demo and say, well, you know, we tried to do this thing, and we chose the waterfall model, and here's 2 weeks of what we don't produce, right?
Well, that's a pretty radical
And my
experiment.
boss is very, very happy with me. So there's
Right.
a lot of pressure from the executive layer
Yeah.
to not do that stuff, right? To not experiment.
Well, you can pretty much guarantee a 50% failure rate if every other sprint you do waterfall and then you do agile, right?
So I guess my question is, what sort of techniques can you apply that actually help you to make that space so that you can try these things out with enough time?
Well, I think you have, what's funny is I think regular agile practice has all that stuff. So the definition of done and the definition of ready are 2 process rules that you get to tweak. I mean, if you've got what I usually think of as an agile team, the team gets some responsibility over what's in there. And if the definition of done is too ridiculous, right, you're going to get velocity 0 every sprint, and that's not good for anybody. So you tweak that yourself, and you are doing that. So when I say a failure rate, I guess I shouldn't use that term very often. What I mean is an invalidation rate. So we believe that by beefing up our definition of ready, we think that our velocity will go from 20 to 24. Okay, so that's a hypothesis, and if we invalidate that hypothesis and get 23, okay, it's not the end of the world. It is the end of the world, though, if we put a lot of the company at risk, like we say, gosh, you know, if we completely change the colors and all of the stuff on GoToMeeting and we ship it next week, we think it'll be awesome, and then, you know, there's a potentially high failure rate. And so you want to actually limit the cost of these failures. So the best thing to do in those situations is to release it to like 1% or 0.1% of your audience and test this theory. You're still testing the theory, but, you know, guess what? Probably it didn't work. So anyway, the reason that we try to hit a 50% failure rate is really to give ourselves some intellectual rigor, that we're saying, you know, we're saying something real. Like we're saying, you know, if we fix this ready thing, we do think that we're going to get 20%, and then you try, and then you try to control the experiment so that you can validate whether it was right or not. But when we don't do a hypothesis, everybody just kind of sits around and goes, well, that's a nice retrospective, and then they do whatever they did before. So that's why I like to push on that. Any questions? Other questions? Yes?
How can you make sure collective responsibility that the things that you're responsible for matches the things that you have power over, or what do you
Right, that's a big issue. Right, and I had to write about that, right? Like one of the issues is that there's 2 issues. One is you have to have the agency, that's what, I don't know, psychologists call it. You have that agency to actually affect things. And if you don't, the one thing you do have agency over in the United States, because we banished slavery a few years ago, is that you can leave the team or the company, but I don't want you to have to do that. So, and you don't have to do that, but you do have to educate. This is why executives have to have such huge control over the agility of individual teams, is because If they don't give you the agency to change these things, then then it's hard to feel responsible. And it turns out the effectiveness of people is less related to how much objective agency they have. Like if someone outside said, hey, Melch, they might say, hey, Melch, you totally have control over that thing. And, are you a developer?
Yep.
I was a developer, I know what this is like. You're going like, really? Like, do I? And that, it turns out that psychologically it is true that most people underestimate their agency from an objective point of view. And so my suggestion is just to have conversations with people about it. Say, hey, it feels like I can't be responsible because I can't do any testing because you guys over in the testing team are so into your testing thing, and it's your thing. I mean, have you ever seen that?
Yes.
Yeah, I was so shocked, right? Like, I'm a developer, right? And I'm going, well, gosh, who wouldn't want to be a developer all the time? And then I met these testers who just love testing, and I'm going like, wow. That's amazing, right? Anyway, so then I thought, oh, well, and I have seen testing teams who are really protective of, we are the testers, we are supposed to test. And then you might have a conversation with them and say, hey, that's not really working. Anyway. Yes?
I saw a number of source references that
Yeah?
I couldn't understand.
Oh.
So are those links, so if we get the slide deck, are we able to
Yeah,
click on those
actually,
links?
all this stuff is on, most of this stuff is on this website. Maybe I should write it down here so I can keep going back and forth, but it's senexrex.com/blog. Okay. That's where all that stuff is. Anyway, you'll see those references like Jocko, 2009. That's a great reference. And there's a lot of all the stuff I write. I'm like not even recovering academic, right? Like everything I write, it just has a zillion references in it, and you should be able to find anything you need.
Great.
But unfortunately, I write too much. Sorry. Yeah, so other questions? So let's see. Oh. It's not working, man. Oh,
It is.
it's just the slowest. Is that a Windows machine? I used to work at Skype, subsidiary of Microsoft. Wow. All right. Actually, I didn't have time to do this, but I have a big mind map that you can see. There's stuff over here because there's this plus sign everywhere. Underneath there's whole categories of patterns that relate to different practices like XP and whatever. So anyway, these are the 5 Agile-based patterns. And my claim is that you can take these patterns and you can go to someone and you can say, hey, John Horton, are you Agile?
Today, yes.
Today.
Fragile Agile.
So I have a question, and the answer may not be interesting to anyone else in the room, so keep it short. But, you say you're a recovering academic. I'm still an academic. I haven't recovered yet. I'm an institution that's in dire need of transformational change is education.
Yeah.
And I think part of your goal here, if I understood it, was to say, let's take this down to first principles so that we can apply these Agile principles, not just to software,
Right.
but to any enterprise.
Right.
Do you have any thought about what an Agile school or university might look like? How do you apply these principles to radically transform how we do things?
Yeah.
Wait, you said you wanted a short answer.
Yeah.
I think,
No, well, I think that, yeah, right, I do want a short answer, but
so the convenience
unless
thing,
other people are interested.
I'm interested. I'm interested because I think companies in general, we end up converting the development department only And that causes lots of problems for us as Agile developers. The
Yes.
problems that it causes is that the finance department isn't itself Agile, and God forbid, you know, like the executive suite is not Agile. Like I want them so desperately to take their strategic goals, and I want them to cut them up into little slices of value. So I want them to test their new performance, you know, grading system for the employees in the company. I want them to test their new recruiting practices, and I want them to do it in one-week chunks. And you can get them to do that, but those guys are the toughest of the bunch, right?
Yeah.
Like they're all super smart. They got there somehow, but they also got there in a non-agile way, and then they whatever. Anyway, we could complain about executives all day long, but there is a group called agileschools.org, and it's I think it's a high school group. I just talked to the guy. It's in San Diego.
Oh, cool.
He and I just got certified Scrum coach designation from Scrum Alliance. And it was kind of funny, the way I met him is I ran into this guy and he goes like, you know, you have to talk to that guy over there at a Scrum meeting. I mean, at a Scrum gathering, which is one of these big things. So he's really good. There's another group, and I'm trying to remember the name of it, but I'll write the name of a person. Errol, A-R-A-L-I-C. So that guy was a National Science Foundation program manager. Are you a professor type?
Yeah.
Okay. So he was at NSF, and he says what I say a lot, which is, you know, these academics are solving these problems in the corner that no one cares about. We need help. And so he said he was one of the program managers for SBIR program, Small Business Innovative Research Grant Program, and that he was my program manager for when I had a startup. So he said, I got to teach these guys lean startup techniques, and he has a whole program for that. He did. Now he's out of NSF, but the reason I put his name there is because you can find material, you can find the name of the program from this. But NSF will teach academics how to do lean startup and encourage them to test those theories with real markets, so that what you want is you want your grad students to actually be working on something of economic consequence, right? That's, for me, that's number one. It was one of the reasons why I actually left academia, is because I just kept getting involved with people who just wanted me to publish papers and stuff, and I'm going like, wow, I could talk about chaos theory all day, right? But is it really valuable to the world? And I don't even know, and that's one of the reasons why I have this conversation, to see if I'm just, you know, smoking some pot somewhere. Anyway, other questions? Other questions? I'm happy to be a resource to anyone who has any questions anytime, especially if you're from Santa Barbara. And this is my address, because I used to work here for a while, 5 years or something. Anyway, really like Santa Barbara and people here. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.